Okay, welcome. Episode 7 of the Clear, Fair and Not Misleading podcast. I'm Wayne Green.
Hi, I'm Gareth Malna.
Thank you, Gareth. And what do we have on this episode? We're going a little bit off piece now from the traditional crypto stuff and moving into.
Haha, nobody ever said traditional and crypto in the same sentence before, but okay, yeah, fair enough. We are moving into the less traditional overseas funds regime space. So yeah, we are moving into investment funds, and in particular, retail investment funds, right?
Yes, so this is a new regime that's appeared on our doorstep in much the same way that the financial promotion regime for crypto did, where we're all trundling along doing our thing, and then something lands that suddenly needs our assistance. And this is for European UCITS funds marketing into the UK currently under the temporary emissions regime.
And in a twist of fate, post-Brexit, the UK has now settled on its regime, the permanent regime that will apply to those funds. It's the overseas funds regime, and it's a slightly different kettle of fish, I would think you would say, from what funds have been used to under the temporary marketing permission regime. So why don't we sort of delve into that a little bit for a moment?
Yeah, so under TMPR, it was um, a transitional arrangement post Brexit that meant all of those funds that were from Europe marketing into the UK, distributing in the UK, could just carry on doing that in the way that they had done when the UK was part of Europe. But of course, we left, and so now we are effectively a third country, or they are third countries to us. I suppose it works both ways. And the new regime that we've all been waiting for is the one that's now out. It's called overseas funds, and the process, I guess, for those managers of funds is firstly one of getting authorized. So the FCA's got landing slots, and it's as sophisticated as looking at the first letter of your Manco, and that determines when your landing slot is. So those firms beginning with A to C, their landing slot is open. They now have to apply under the OFR regime to the FCA to become recognized, I guess, under this process. And as you can imagine, that involves lots of form filling. And within those forms is a little section that says, will you be marketing or communicating with UK investors? And that's the first key bit. It doesn't say retail, it just says UK investors. And if you say yes, it wants to know who is going to be approving your communications in the UK. And of course, the answer is you'll be using us to do that because we have authorization and capability and staff and everything that's needed to see that through. And I guess the key difference, let's talk about differences, because that starts to help us talk about what it's like working with someone like us in this regime. The key difference is that you are not now just filling out a form, getting your funds listed on a register that says these guys are fine, and then off you go doing your own thing. We are a third country. So you're getting that bit that I've just mentioned, but then to continue marketing here, you need someone authorized in the UK to review your documents, give it sign off. You will probably be using distributors in the UK who are also FCA authorized, and Gareth, that comes with it a few implications, right?
Yeah, that's right. So ultimately, distributors in the UK are basically mostly tech platforms to some degree or another. They might be, there might be people, I suppose, that sit between you and as the fund manager, and then the sort of advisor network that goes out and sells these products to you. But ultimately, what you are concerned with in that context is one, who your audience is under the rules. So let's answer that question. Just because you're saying we only market our funds to institutionals or to just to the advisor market, the professional clients, I suppose you would call them, doesn't mean that that's where it stops. The flow of those communication materials will end up in retail hands, and so you are going to have to be mindful of the fact that your promotional material isn't just institutional only. And you can therefore just say, well, clearly we're not marketing to retail and none of this really matters. I don't think that sort of analysis is going to fly in this case. The other thing is the expectations, I suppose, of those distributors who are allowing you, I suppose, to market your products through the UK. And I'll come on to a bit more detail on that in a bit, I suppose, on things like value and costs. But I suppose the key piece is that in order to be able to distribute promotional materials, whether that's your website, your prospectus, supplement, key facts documents, you know, monthly fact sheets, etc., you are going to have to get those approved either by a UK-authorised entity within your group or by a third party. And those materials are going to have to be assessed against the UK's fair, clear, not misleading style guidance. Now, of course, there's going to be a bit of the fact fund managers will probably be thinking, well, we do this already, right, under TMPR, so no change really. So, Wayne, I suppose there's going to be, I think, probably a slight difference in how the FCA looks at funds marketing under the OFR.
Yeah, there's sort of two pieces at play here, isn't there? So there's firstly, if you consider that UK fund managers or UK fund operators are authorised by the regulator, and with that comes a whole load of regulatory responsibility, they would be pretty hacked off if access to the UK market from outside the UK was super simple and didn't have any at all of the same requirements, expectations, protections, and so on of the UK market. So you don't want to create a completely unlevel playing field. But at the same time, you don't want to completely shut the doors to European funds access in the UK. So there's that sense to it. On the more regulatory side then, and what that means, there's the prescribed requirement to register under OFR. So that's fill out the forms and do all of the various bits and pieces that are needed to properly fill out that form. But then once you're in the UK, and as you're proving to the regulator, the FCA, that you're able to be registered under the OFR, then you look at things like the consumer duty principle, and in particular the cross-cutting rules. So although you as a operator of funds outside the UK are not under the direct regulatory jurisdiction of the FCA, you in effect will be almost by proxy, because a financial promotion approver, and we talk about promotion, if you're a marketer, you think promotion is something very different to what the regulator thinks, right? It's basically any communication, pretty much. It's not just something that says, buy me, get great returns. So you are using someone like us to approve your promotions. We are required to meet all of the COBS rules, for example, but then also all the consumer duty requirements. And so too are your probably key distributors, the platforms, the advisors, the wealth managers, the FMs in the UK. And we all have to look across the full distribution chain. And of course, that includes the products and the people managing those, even though they're not directly authorized themselves. So a lot of those requirements are going to impact on the way you operate in the UK, even if you yourself are not authorized by the regulator directly. And that starts to shape what firms like ours need to do and what platforms need to do, and as a result, what you need to be mindful of.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? It's, you've used this example before, Wayne, I know, but we are the voodoo doll in this mix, right? The rules kind of stab us, and the Manco kind of feels that pain, having to sort of comply with that set of requirements without actually being directly subject to them. But you can see the policy outcome is fair there, right? And you're right that UK managers would be pretty hacked off if funds from outside Europe didn't suddenly have to comply with those consumer duty requirements. So then there's a piece around costs, and that's one of the other key differences, I suppose. And it comes back to, one, the difference in regulatory approach, and two, as we sort of alluded to earlier, the impact of the products on the distributed networks that you might be using, particularly the platforms. And in the EEA in Europe, there is the undue cost regime, which looks, as it does in Europe. And then in the UK, slightly more robust regime, you might say, the assessment of value regime for UK authorised funds, which doesn't just require, red, green, amber scoring of cost analyses of the funds, or at least the value provided by the fund, but also requires people to demonstrate how they've calculated the value and how they've justified their position. And I think it's fair to say probably quite a lot more work involved in getting to the COBS AOV position than, the COL AOV position than the undue cost piece in Europe. Is there some detail in that way that people kind of need to be aware of and how they might attack it here?
Yeah, it sort of gets to the point a little on what we have to do and what distributors have to do. And as you say, the requirements when you register under OFR are not super prescribed, and it doesn't say that this OCF is too high and this one is fine, just like we don't have that in the UK because the regulator is clearly not going to do that, nor do we want them to, because we don't want them to be a cost regulator. And so let's say you've decided that the opportunity in the UK, either by virtue of your current investor base or the potential that you could get, is such that you want to register under OFR and keep marketing. And I think for a lot of firms, that's the case, right? So there's some work involved and some costs involved, but you've made that decision, you've assessed the pros and cons, and so here you are doing this thing. The costs piece is from Europe, you talk about undue costs. So that just sounds like, let's suppose the conclusion you need to come to is that my fund is not too expensive. That's sort of what it's saying. In the UK, the difference is that you have to say or conclude that it delivers value. And if it doesn't, you're going to do something about that. And there's quite a gap between the two. Now, there is nothing prescribed that says a fund, a UCITS from Europe, marketing in, has to do a full COL or COBS, it's in both, AOV for their funds. However, as we've already said, we, as the approver of promotions or marketing or comms, do have to think about value. So are the products that we are effectively marketing delivering value to customers? But then probably more impactful is the distributors, the platforms, who also have to make sure that the value delivered to their customers is good or justified, or however you want to phrase it. And they have to look across the whole distribution chain. And so the way they do that for UK funds is they receive the AOV report from the managers and they react on the basis of what that says. So we've seen quite often now a fund that has a red flag, let's say, for some reason it's not delivering value, they will actually have their buy facility removed from platforms or be removed from platforms completely. So now your distribution has disappeared from some of those often key players. As you've rightly said, the platforms are often driven by tech, which is understandable because often they start out as tech firms, but at the very least, they need to have massive scale and deal with huge transaction volumes, so they have to be tech enabled. But what that means is they cannot really or efficiently develop super nuanced processes that take account of the difference between an undue cost assessment and a UK value assessment. So what they want to see, and they are getting heat from the regulator themselves on this, what they want to see is that any European fund distributing in through them can demonstrate that it's assessed the value or the costs or whatever word you want to use in a way that they can say is sufficient for their comfort, as compared with all the UK funds that are doing this super robust version with quite a wordy, weighty document. And that's the gap that we're looking to fill. So we've helped firms with things that we refer to as AOV lite or undue cost plus, whatever you want to call it, that doesn't go the whole COL version, doesn't go the full route, but does go beyond a little what the undue cost assessment might be, and does it in a way that you can present that to the platforms and to us, in fact, if you're using a firm like ours, to say, we're not under call, we haven't done all that thing, but we've given it proper thought, it has some rigor, it has some continuity year on year, so we're not just making it up each year to suit what we want the answer to be. But it's also not so light touch as to just be a green box or a yes somewhere on an EMT that means we've decided it delivers value and we're not going to show you the workings. And that's the key bit. And that's probably the best example, I think, of how the rules that apply in the UK, although not directly applied to non-UK firms, actually ends up by contagion or proxy regulation or whatever you want to call it, ends up impacting on how they function and operate and look at their stuff.
That's great, and absolutely right. And I suppose as one example of how people who try to market it under these rules need to think about this regime slightly differently to what they're already experiencing, either in Europe or under the temporary marketing regime. There's another one which we haven't yet touched upon, but is worth thinking about. And I don't think there's a position on this yet fully, but here's my understanding. And here we're talking about facilities. So, in the UK, to market in from a third country, you are required currently under the temporary marketing permission regime, the Section 272 regime, to maintain facilities here for any person where the participant effectively in the fund can redeem or arrange for redemption of units in the scheme. Now, the wording of that rule under the OFR is slightly different, because it says that the operator must maintain facilities for any unit holder in the scheme in the United Kingdom. So far, so similar to submit orders to subscribe for and redeem units in the scheme in accordance with the terms of the prospectus. And so what's happened there is that you've dropped the words arrange for, and what that leads us to believe is that actually to provide facilities, which is a very common service in the UK, actually now requires permission, and arranging permission, because you're no longer just sitting in the middle of a party that is on the one hand unauthorised because they're a manager in Europe, and somebody who can do the doing of redemption of units in the scheme in a kind of unauthorised capacity, kind of straight pass-through, basically allowing people to come to you, see the prospectus and make those arrangements. With that wording dropped, you are effectively only able to submit orders to subscribe for and redeem. And if you're submitting orders to subscribe for or redeem, you are doing the kind of regulated activity of arranging. So there's a nuance thing that people are going to have to think through there, I suspect, particularly if they have, for instance, UK MiFID entity who might be authorised, but does that MiFID entity have permissions to deal with retail? If it is just portfolio manager selling portfolio management services back to the group Manco on a kind of professional client only basis. So it's just another little nuance to kind of work through, I would say.
Yeah, when you think about everything we've said so far about the approach here, we think, or as we see it, in a sort of helicopter view, you can see that quite rightly you don't want UK access to be so easy from people that are not UK regulated that it becomes almost a dual regulatory approach, or even regulated if you're UK and completely unregulated if you're not. So when you wrap all this together, you can see that if you're communicating, then that needs to be done and approved by someone that's authorised, so that the regulator can point a finger and actually come down on someone that's not doing that thing properly, not reviewing the stuff properly. And also, if you're in the UK and you want to be able to, redeem an investment in a fund, then there's someone in the UK that's responsible for that, who the regulator has some jurisdiction over and can come to, hold accountable, ask questions, review what they're doing, their processes, and basically keep some degree of consumer protection in place for someone that's dealing with a non-regulated entity. And so it would, to my mind, it kind of makes sense that that's where it's landed on. As you say, it's as yet untested, and we're trying to make sure we get clarity on that. But it's one of those areas that I think is definitely different from the way it was handled before. And as I say, in the context of everything else we've just talked about, it would make sense that that's the approach that they're taking.
And so then put yourself in the position of a kind of manager, Wayne. You are sat in Europe, you're currently marketing under the TMPR. And then suddenly OFR comes along. What do you need to be thinking about now, particularly if you're A, B, or C, in terms of I need to be ready for this? And I suppose one element to that, to kind of put you on the spot a little bit, is do I have any alternatives? Is it OFR or bust? Or have I got other ways that I can continue to do what I do?
So it feels like it's come pretty quickly. So certainly I have some sympathy with those firms that begin A, B, and C, because it's sort of a complex, untested situation for them to try and think through. However, we've seen that and been involved in a lot of those conversations. And I think where people have landed is that if you are distributing in the UK, you have UK investors, then you need to do something. That's the first point, right? Doing nothing is not an option. The difference between TMPR and OFR means that there is a cost to that and there is complexity to it. But of course there will be, because the UK is not in Europe anymore. And so the equivalence that exists there that the FCA will use when it assesses applications only goes so far. It's, what can your fund do versus what can the UK funds do? And is that equivalent enough that we can let you access it? That's the full extent of it. So it's going to look different. The assessment that I think the firms should be making is, do we want to continue to be present in the UK? If you've already got people with assets in your funds here, then you are going to want to continue, because I guess the alternative is that you get them out of your funds, or at the very least, stop making available. That's not going to be very attractive. So it's basically a commercial decision. How much is it going to cost me to do that? Is it worth my while given the revenue I'm generating, or could potentially generate if I hit the ground and do some marketing here? That's the first bit. And then once you start to look at the regime, there are then two things I think to look at. One is, do we say that we're not marketing to UK investors? And again, this point that I was speaking to Fiona about earlier, it says UK investors, not UK retail investors, which I think is an important distinction. The first reaction for firms is to think, well, I don't, put adverts on buses and fact sheets in coffee shops, so I'm not doing that. But the reality is, if you're distributing through professionals to end retail, then you are going to need to communicate to them somehow to build brand profile, just from a marketing perspective, but also to support understanding on a pass-through basis, even from advisors and DFMs to end customers. So something's going to be there, right? Those investors are going to want to go on a website and see, who on earth is this person that my advisors put me with? Oh, here they are. There's your promotion, right? That's the first bit. So not marketing and using that kind of exemption, I would view that more as applicable to firms that go purely very institutional. So you're selling to pension funds, to banks or asset managers that deal on accounts in a proprietary way, as opposed to using customer money. Then the second bit is the NPPR, and whether you can almost self-categorize your UCITS as an AIF and go that route, which is, I can understand where that's coming from, but there's some I guess mental gymnastics at play there, which is there a way that we can get into the UK or stay in the UK without being captured by the OFR? Because you're rushing to try and fill a form and it looks pretty complex. It has some extra requirements on you, but even at a very basic level, that restricts who you can market to. And so is that going to tie up with your target market assessment, which, remember, is going to be more detailed now under MiFID and Consumer Duty, actually, than it had ever been before? Can you prove that to the regulator? And then secondly, still requires Annex 4 reporting under AFMD, which A, tells the regulator everything that you're doing and where it's coming from, your assets in the UK. So again, you're going to have to make sure that that tallies with what you're saying about your distribution and your target market. And B, Annex 4 reporting is a pain. It's massive. And the firms that provide that service for Annex 4 reporting probably cost about the same as firms that will just help you market into the UK anyway. So it's not quite the utopian get out that perhaps was hoped for.
Yeah, and there's a lot of complexity in that AIFMD MPPR analysis. There's two potential routes through that, whether through the passport or not. So, it is worth thinking about early. And early is a very important point here, right? Because one, the application process to apply for the OFR is going to take some time to do, and there are providers out there who can help you with that. But two, if you do need to find a financial promotion approver, that won't be a one phone call and agreed kind of process, right? There is a process to go through, and it will take probably about 4 weeks, and the landing slots are for 8 weeks, 12 weeks. So of that window, a third gets used up by finding an approver. Probably a third gets used up by actually filling in the form, and the first third probably gets used by trying to get up to speed on what you need to do in the first place. So
yeah,
it's probably worth a reminder on the landing slot dates. We have it on our blog, which we can share with a link to the podcast, I'm sure. But the A managers, their landing slots are the 1st of November to the 31st of January. The Bs, 1st of January to the 31st of March. And the Cs, the 1st of March to the 31st of May. So there's overlap between A's, B's and C's. But those dates are rapidly approaching and are already here if you are an A. And in fact, you're already 2 weeks into the first A slot, so not many more to go is the message, really.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've certainly spoken to ashen-faced people recently.
Yeah, and the onboard process for us reflects the responsibility that we have and the work that we have to do to fulfill it. So, as we've said, it's the full might of the UK regulatory regime sits on our shoulders as well as the platform distributors' shoulders, and so that means we need to be comfortable with who we're dealing with. So there's due diligence, there's KYB to go through. Obviously, there's contractual arrangements to deal with, and then we need to understand what those funds do. We need to understand what those funds say they do, and we need to work out how we monitor that that's actually the case. So we cannot just say it's a growth fund, here you go, here's the fact sheet. We need to make sure that the growth fund is saying in its prospectus or supplement what it does to achieve growth, where it invests, to what extent, how do we make sure that's actually happening on an ongoing basis. And then you get into the cost piece, and then what your distribution model is, what documents we're going to review, how we're going to make sure that that's done in good time, so that you can, for example, get your January fact sheets, end of Jan fact sheets out the first week in February, as everyone will want to do. So we have to make sure we have all that good review process and data sharing set up so we can get that achieved. There's a lot to think about, which is way beyond just the simple emailing as a PDF and saying, check that for us, would you? That's certainly not the way it's going to be. And our experience tells us the regulators looking at this stuff in a much more focused, rigorous manner than they have done in the past for financial promotions. But having talked about all of the work and its costs and etc., and it looks different now and it's not that easy, my sort of take on this is that if you just set aside for a minute the fact that these managers, these fund operators, have been able to come into the UK effectively for no cost, it's been very, very easy. Ignore that for a minute and just consider that European managers can access the UK by appointing a Section 21 approver, making a once application to the FCA